Hello, and welcome to week 4 in the Psychology of Personality, where we're going to be taking on 2 chapters again, chapters 5 and 6. So let's get started to take a look at the course book material that we have, and we are going to be introducing to the Neo-Freudian perspectives on personality. Neo means new. It's not just the name of the character in Matrix. Neo means that there's a new school of thought or an existing school of thought, or even in the history, I mean, just saying new, but some of the characters we're going to be talking about are no longer with us, but that there's still current thought going in the psychodynamic perspective of personality, the id, the ego, and the superego, and the concepts that Freud put forth, primarily by his daughter, Anna Freud, who focused on a number of areas, defense mechanisms being the area that she really expanded upon. And this is one of the lasting legacies of Freud, is ego defense mechanisms, which we'll get into a little part. I just want to introduce you a little bit of the work of, I believe it was Karen Horney, who worked a lot with children, and one of the tools that they used to examine the intrapsychic abilities, what's going on in children, is their drawings and interpreting their drawings. And so in the book I talk about, I show an example of 2 drawings, and if you looked at these drawings, one child gives you the top one, it's colorful, the sun, everybody's holding hands, it's the picture of their family, and then you look at the other one and there's marks all over it. You can check out the course book. There's something different about these children. However, that kind of grew into the world of play therapy. Very different, very non-judgmental, non-directive form of therapy to work with small children who are going through challenging times. But we have to be careful about the interpretation of their drawings. And I give you an example, kind of a funny example in there. It shows a lady, and she seems to be pole dancing with everybody. And this was what the assignment was. What does your mommy do for work? What do you want when you grow up? This is what I want to do. And everybody has these dollar bills while she's up there dancing. The truth is she's selling a shovel. She works over at Home Depot. And let's be careful about those interpretations on. So let's go right in here. Neo-Freudian and Anna Freud's world of defense mechanisms. The lasting legacy of Sigmund Freud is, what we have to realize is, anxiety is interpreted by Freud as the ego trying to deal with a conflict between the id that wants to be selfish and the superego that is obeying the rules of society, or whatever we've chosen to identify as the standard of behavior. That anxiety is uncomfortable. Anxiety is just determined. We want to minimize anxiety. That's a primary goal of the ego. So the ego can do a number of things, and those things are defenses to protect the ego from the pain of the anxiety of having this conflict. So let's just kind of put this into you're in an argument with your spouse, and it's very uncomfortable. You love them, but they just did something really nasty. And so here you are with this kind of, what do I do with this? I'm in pain. Now, I'm going to go through this, pretty kind of Pollyannish. That's obviously a serious thing. There's ways to deal with this. But some of the ways in which people cope with that include these different defense mechanisms. How do I protect myself from the anxiety of this individual who I care about very much, who just did something very hurtful? How do I deal with that? So the first one that I talk about is regression. Now, regression is when we, in our minds, we go back in time and we regress our personality to a time when it was happy. And we may act differently. I mean, in terms of certain extremes of regression, we might even return to more of a childhood type of personality, that I'm going to go back to that time when this didn't happen. And I'm going to live there. And that will be how I cope with that. The next one is repression, controversial one. And that is a repression is I will take that memory and I'll stuff it into a hole in my mind and ignore it. This is motivated by me to do that. I am going to simply put it away. That is different than some of the other things that look like that, but they put it away, and they then can sometimes create a situation where they actually have a difficult time remembering it. You might go up to someone and say, don't you remember when Stan did that before? And they're like, nope, Stan's never done that before. And you're like, repressed memory right there. You put it away and you forgot where you put it. Next one is reaction formation. This is an interesting one. This is being really, really nice to somebody. Reaction formation is like, okay, they just did something. I'm going to be super sweet to them. They're going to come home. They just did something really bad to me. I'm going to make them their best dinner. I'm going to be really nice to them. Put their feet up, watch the movie, do stuff like that. That's a way to deal with that anxiety. Next one, isolation. I'm going to separate myself from that person. And of course, this is a relationship. Isolating doesn't work for the long term, and you're still stuck with all those negative feelings. Undoing, you making an effort to reverse the consequences of that and make it not exist anymore, and within that power. Projection. Now, projection is interesting with my example because projection is usually used when somebody is, let's say, I'm at fault for something. Like, say I'm the guy, and I did something bad, and my wife comes up to me and said, you did this and blah, blah. And then I say, wait a minute, no, that was you. You're the one who's, you're jumping to conclusions. I'm projecting that guilt onto the other person and therefore avoiding taking that guilt to me. Sound familiar? Anybody? Probably. Somebody doing that. That's a defense mechanism. And people can get really good at that. They can get good at, you're going up to confront somebody. It's clear they've done something and you're walking away going, I'm a piece of crap. Somebody has just projected on you. And you need to be on the watch for that. Introjection is the opposite. It's the individual. Go back to my original thing. He's done something bad, she loves him, and stuff like that. And she actually says, I deserved it. Does that sound familiar? That can be also something that happens. Somebody will just say, I deserve that, or I really didn't do that. I really made that mistake. It's my fault. And when you get projection and introjection happening at the same time, wow, talk about a perfect storm. The relationship that builds out of that is pretty negative. Turning against yourself. This could be a depression, suicidal stuff, suicide, just not taking care of your body, overeating, undereating, all the ways that we just kind of punish ourselves. Not enough that somebody, we buy into the idea it's our fault and we're going to punish ourselves for it. The next one is sublimation. Now, sublimation is a positive outlet. Something happens bad to me and I go and I write poetry or I write music or I go for a run or I do something positive to kind of deal with that. And of course, the big one, right? Denial. To simply deny that. You can see denial in a lot of these, but denial is sort of like the big one that says, this didn't happen, it's not real. Now, what we need to understand is that Freud felt that these were necessary parts of our personality. They protected the ego from pain. So, when we look at, say, denial, somebody does something, we hear about it and we're like, no way. That initial response of disbelief, which is, if it turns out to be true, can be characterized as denial, is actually something that protects us from the initial thrust of that disappointment of, no, I'm not going to, that didn't happen. Imagine getting told something at work. Or, even a tragedy, and you get called at work and like, no, that didn't happen. No, that instantaneous saying this didn't happen is helping you get through the moment. That's why Freud and Anna Freud identified these mechanisms. The problem is when they get out of hand, if you stay in denial, or if you stay in introjection, or you stay in isolation, you stay in repression, and the thing never gets dealt with, that's when it gets wrong. And that's the next section in the course book when we look at the levels of this. So level 1 being psychotic, that you're separated from reality, you're too tied into the defense mechanism. Immature means you're not emotionally mature in terms of dealing with the situation. You go to neurotic, that's a more, obsessive compulsive piece to it. And then there's mature. You're using the defense mechanism maturely, moving from a defense mechanism into appropriate ways for dealing with the anxiety. Okay, so the other big topic that comes up in this particular chapter is object relations theory, and that is the idea that when people are born, they bond. We talk about attachment in early life, and that these relationships to people, to objects, to a piece of land, to an idea, we bond emotionally with them. And object relations theory discusses the nature of that bond and how it changes over time. In the example I use, classic, we have Linus from the Peanuts comic strip, who has a security blanket. That's his thing that he's bonded with, and it's a running gag in the entire series of cartoons by Charles Schulz. And he has part of the cartoon explores that relationship between Linus, who in the character is probably the most intellectual, the most philosophical, but yet has this blanket that he needs in order to feel secure. And we can kind of what is the relationship between his maturing personality and the blanket, and what it does when it gets taken away and whatnot. And clearly there's this sort of, that's the humor of the comic, is this, you have this kid who has a security blanket, quoting philosophers from ancient Greece, so that's the humor of it. But that idea of attaching to something, and then it's the development of that relationship that you have with the object, the person, or whatever. There's a beginning, a middle, and ultimately an end. And so the mature passing through of those changes in our relationships to objects. And sometimes, as with Linus, we can become stuck with something. We see it in, let's say, overindulgent and helicopter parents who have really developed an attachment with their kids, and they're struggling to let them go and let them be adults. You can see the same thing, kids who are failure to launch. They have an attachment with their parents, and they just can't seem to let that go and go through the natural stages of maturation. So here we are at the end of this chapter. We have a discussion and a quiz. The discussion is for you to kind of go through that list of defense mechanisms. Let's talk about those instances in which you've done those things. Let's all raise our hand and say we've all done it. And then I want you, in your own words, to kind of talk about that object relations things. Remember, there's stuff in my course book that's really not enough. Read the textbook as well to get into some. Look it up online. Look up that work to get some additional things and give me a nice rich discussion of that particular topic. Some examples would be great too. If you've had some of those, security blankets, or maybe there's a stuffed animal that you have that you still have as an adult, or maybe there's an object that you really care about in your life, or a person, let's say, that you went through a relationship and then a breakup, and you can kind of trace that whole evolution of the relationship in object relations theory. Before we get into the next chapter, I want to talk a little bit about what we're kind of seeing at this point. Right here, we're seeing the emergence of women in psychology. We're seeing, straight in the chapter 5, a lot of the people who continued with Freud were the women. The men seem to have separated. They had conflicts with them, and we have the growth of psychology there. And certainly there are women that separated from him. But he had a following of women. His daughter, Karen Horney, that we're going to be looking at right now, Klein, and these individuals that really carried forth the ideas and were powerful forces in the development of psychology. We're leading into the next chapter. We're going to be talking about the psychology of women. And so we see this powerful force of women in an age when simultaneously the men who were in the field of psychology recognized the importance of women to be in the field, yet at the same time barred them from it. So sometimes the education of women in the field of psychology was taking place unofficially, or they had to travel around until they could find some place that was willing to accept a woman into the graduate studies and whatnot. And so it was a time of, it was tough to be a woman psychologist. I would imagine that environment kind of made sure that the people that did make it to the top were strong women. And I don't mean that in any negative way. It's just that's kind of who made it. And we see these very powerful personalities interacting with each other. There's that Klein and Anna Freud had a very conflictual relationship. Two very powerful, very effective speakers and researchers and whatnot, both coming from Freud, one being the daughter of Freud, and they had conflicts that kind of traced in the history of psychology. So some interesting stuff there. We're into chapter 6, and we're looking at some pretty different concepts here growing out of the personality theory of Freud, and essentially Karen Horney coming along and talking about the female psyche and being one of the first voices that comes out and says, that women are not necessarily, as according to Freud, that women are not necessarily or are not an inferior man. They're not less than men psychically. And that's kind of like the basic premise of Freud's theory, was there were men, and then there beneath them were women who were not quite up to par. And so she really did a lot of work in that area. You're probably familiar with some of the strange topics that Freud explored, such as the discovery of young girls that they don't have a penis, and that created in them a sense of anxiety that they didn't have one, therefore they're not as worthy, and created what he called penis envy, which was a source of anxiety for girls for the rest of their lives. And you can see how strange this sounds in our modern world to think about that, but yet this was the running theory of the time. Horney went as far as saying that boys had womb envy, and that this is not a one-way street, and really kind of countered some of those ideas and really progressed the idea of women's psychology, women equal psychology in the field of it. So we start to see what did Horney say about anxiety and what. And she did say that the neurotic things of childhood, the conflicts of childhood, were the source of problems. She was okay with that. She supported that they can only develop within a cultural context. So we see that, kind of principle to the way we're approaching this class, that culture plays a very, very important role in terms of creating the situations of those anxieties, keeping in mind that superego is fed and nurtured by culture. It's the right and wrong, the moral values and whatnot of behavior are fed by our culture than our id, which is, and that, so obviously lots of culture there. And she herself did not feel that she was refuting Freud's work, but, refining it, sharpening the sword, let's say. Okay, so then she defines some personality types, and we see some of the first kind of like categorizing of different people in here that we're going to see in some of the later theories here. And so she said there was a compliant personality, kind of just need for an affection, need to get along with the people around them. There's aggressive personality, which is they sought to dominate and to be number one in a particular situation. She thought that was kind of those kinds of people. And then a detached personality that's sort of aloof to and not really involved in those kinds of whether you're pleasing people or whether you want to be number one, you're sort of detached. So, kind of a nice triad of personality types. And further divided, because she was very socially, culturally oriented, further divided people's actions, another name for personality, into exchange relationships and communal relationships. Exchange relationships were based on a degree of reciprocity. Communal is when you assumed or people assumed the responsibility for others that we're going to, a shared, not necessarily tit for tat. I'm in a communal relationship, such as a family. I don't go shopping and then come home with the food and expect my kids to do anything special because I'm giving them food. We're communal. I'm doing this because I'm taking a responsibility for that. Whereas in a work situation, in work social relationships, I do work for somebody, I'm expecting to get paid. There's a reciprocity there. In many friendships, we might have reciprocal aspects. There's communal aspects to friendships as well, but the complexity of friendships, but there's also reciprocity. If I'm going to share with you my deepest, darkest, I expect you to do the same thing. So there's sort of a reciprocity there. And when that doesn't happen, it kind of threatens the relationship. Okay, and then along comes Erich Fromm. Now, Erich Fromm was a student of Freud and actually had a PhD in sociology. And so brings to that, the same reason I so much like teaching psychology and sociology, kind of two sides of the same coin. He really talked a lot about modern society and the effect that it was having on people. That the freedoms that we experience with technology, there's probably no better time to talk about that than right now. Here we are taking advantage of technology that is unbelievable. This is so great that we can continue going to school. We can continue talking with each other, continue interacting with each other. We can Zoom meetings, we can post things online, we can interact in real time, those kinds of things. And yet, we still feel isolated. That Erich Fromm really was focusing on the idea that as cultures were becoming more and more modern and technology was creeping into every aspect of our lives, that one of the risks of that was a part isolation. When we all had to chip in to make the laundry happen instead of the washing machine, we were together. We were with other people. As we have moved to have machines replace some of those tasks, which I'm not against. I'm not against technology at all. But it hasn't balanced out with, or we've had to balance that out with other ways of socializing. I mean, we go out more and we go out and socialize with friends, realizing that there was a day and age you went out with friends or you got together with people twice a year. You got, for holidays, for weddings, that's when you saw people. You were working all the time, but you were working with family all the time. Nowadays, we've sort of replaced that with the going out. So, we have a whole week of work, and then Friday night, at least before all this happened, we'd go out and have a good time with our friends and family. The challenge of technology, it hasn't replaced that intimate togetherness. And Fromm recognized this way before COVID, obviously way before that, recognizing that this is going to be a challenge. Yes, we have great technology to do this, but we still need to meet with people, still need to be in their physical presence. He thought that was very important for that. So here we are at the end of the chapter. We have our assessments, 2 discussions, and a quiz. And the first discussion is to examine the personality types that Kornharney put out there. And do you know people like that? Which one would you fit in? That kind of thing. Then we talk about Eric Fromm's theory. Let's have a discussion about that. What does freedom mean in a highly technological society that can create isolation? And finally, we're going to look at a topic that Karen Horney brought up of self-realization, the desires, I'm reading it right, for perfection, ambition, and triumph. What does that to do with your life? And that'll be just you sharing your own ideas about that particular aspect of your personality. So I hope this has been a good lecture for you, a little bit longer than I thought I was going to go, but that's what I do, just talk and talk. It's part of my personality. So I will see you all in the discussion boards.